Before the Duke of Cravenwood ever learned Eleanor Hartwell's name, he had already decided, on the strength of a servant's gossip and a cold morning's temper, that she did not deserve a chair in his hall. And it would take the better part of a year, and the whole of his pride, for him to discover how wrong a man could be while believing himself entirely correct. The quarter-court at Cravenwood Hall was held 4 times a year in the great stone hall beneath the old hammer-beam roof, and on the appointed mornings the tenantry came in from the frost-stiffened lanes to render their accounts, air their grievances, and be seen, briefly, by the man who owned the ground beneath their feet. Chairs lined the days in strict order of consequence. The rest stood, because standing had always been the arrangement, and no one at Cravenwood had thought to question an arrangement simply because it was old. On the morning in question the hall smelled of wet wool and beeswax, and the Duke, Julian Thorne, sat at the centre of the dais with a ledger he had not asked for balanced unhappily on his knee, in a temper that had nothing to do with any person yet to arrive. It was the anniversary of his father's death, a fact he had not mentioned to anyone, and would not, and grief in him had long since curdled into a kind of vigilant coldness that his household had learned to read the way sailors read weather. Before the doors opened to the first petitioner, his cousin's companion, Miss Verity Colcroft, leaned near his shoulder and murmured that the Hartwell girl was expected in her father's place today, the old land agent being laid up with a seizure of the joints, and that it was, in her opinion, a very great presumption for a girl of that station to imagine herself equal to a man's accounts. "She has been keeping the books since spring, I am told," Verity said, with the particular relish of a woman repeating an unkindness she had not troubled to verify, as though arithmetic were a substitute for breeding. The Duke said nothing, which she took, as people often did, for agreement, and the judgment settled into him unexamined, the way judgments do when a man is too tired and too sad to interrogate his own mind. Simmons, who had buttled at Cravenwood since the Duke was in short coats, and who therefore possessed a working knowledge of the family's moods that no member of the family would have credited him with, stood at his post beside the great doors, and watched the morning assemble itself with the particular dread of a man who has seen this exact temper before and knows it rarely ends the hour without some small casualty. He had already warned the second footman to keep the sherry well clear of his Grace's elbow, and had privately resolved to keep his own remarks to himself, a resolution he generally kept for as long as it suited him, and not 1 moment longer. The first 2 petitioners of the morning were dispatched with the brisk, joyless efficiency the Duke brought to every quarter-court since his father's death, a tenant's request for a new roof-beam granted without a word of comfort attached to it, a dispute over a boundary hedge settled so quickly that both parties left uncertain whether they had won or lost. Lady Beatrice, seated 2 chairs down the days with her needlework abandoned in her lap, watched her nephew with the particular unease of a woman who had buried a brother and did not care to watch his son bury himself by degrees in the same cold ground. She had said nothing that morning, sensing correctly that nothing she said would be heard, and had contented herself with sending Simmons twice for tea neither of them wanted, simply to have something to occupy her hands. The hall filled steadily as the morning wore on, farmers and millers and the wives of men too proud or too unwell to come themselves, the low murmur of 100 private griefs and grievances folded into the public business of rents and repairs, and beneath it all the particular, watchful quiet of people who had learned, over generations, that a duke's temper was whether to be endured rather than a thing that could be reasoned with. The doors opened on a line of tenants numb with cold, and among them, near the back, came a young woman in a plain grey travelling cloak with mud to the hem, carrying 2 ledgers bound in cracked leather and a canvas satchel that had clearly been packed by someone in a hurry. She had left before dawn. The low lane by Fenner's Brook had flooded in the night, as it always did in a wet spring, and she had gone the long way round by the mill road to avoid it, arriving with barely a quarter-hour to spare and no time to present herself properly to the house before being swept into the queue with the rest. She had not slept well, her father had passed a bad night, and she had sat up with him until the physician came at 4, and there had been no one else to send in his place, because there was no one else who understood the accounts. Eleanor Hartwell had kept her father's ledgers since she was 14 years old, at first as a game he had taught her out of loneliness after her mother died, and then, in the last 2 years, as his hands grew unreliable, as the whole quiet substance of the work. She knew the Cravenwood accounts better than any clerk in the house, though no one on the days that morning knew it, and she had come today only because there had been no other way for the estate's business to be done, not because she imagined herself owed a place among the gentry. The hall was full by the time she reached the front of the standing crowd, every chair along the dais occupied but one, an old high-backed chair set slightly apart near the foot of the dais steps that had, without anyone quite deciding it, become known over 3 generations as the land agent's chair, because Josiah Hartwell's own father had been given leave to sit there once, decades before, for a bad hip, and no steward since had presumed to claim the courtesy again. Eleanor did not know this history. She knew only that her arms ached from the weight of the ledgers, that her legs trembled from a night without sleep, and that the chair was empty. She sat. The hall was not a place accustomed to noticing a single small motion, but the Duke noticed it at once. The way a man in a black mood notices anything that offers itself as a target, and something in him, still raw from Verity's murmured unkindness and raw still from the private grief of the day, hardened into words before he had troubled to ask a single question. No one invited you to sit. His voice was not loud, but the hall was built to carry even a quiet voice to every corner of it, and the words landed in the silence like a dropped plate. Every face turned. Eleanor felt the heat come up her throat, felt for one instant the old animal urge to apologize and scramble upright and make herself smaller. And then she felt something else entirely, a kind of clarifying anger that steadied rather than shook her. She rose, not quickly, not with the flustered haste that would have satisfied the room's appetite for a small humiliation, but slowly, settling her ledgers under one arm as she did, and she did not sit again. "Forgive me, your grace," she said, in a voice pitched to carry no further than his own had. "I am Eleanor Hartwell. My father is confined to his bed and cannot attend you, and so I have come in his place, with his accounts, which I believe you will find in good order." She did not lower her eyes. The Duke, who had expected retreat and had not received it, found himself for one disorienting moment without a reply, and in the silence his own steward, Miss Pruitt, cleared his throat and began, with visible discomfort, to read out the quarter's disputed matter, a boundary dispute over a drainage ditch between 2 tenant farms, and the tally of costs each side claimed. Eleanor listened, standing, her spine very straight. And when Pruitt finished reading a figure that was wrong by no small margin, she corrected him, plainly and without apology, citing the actual survey measurements her father had taken the previous autumn, measurements Pruitt had evidently never troubled to consult. The hall, which moments before had been savouring her humiliation, went very still in a different way. No one in that room forgot it. Not the tenants who repeated it in the taproom that night, not Pruitt who flushed a dull red and did not meet her eye again, and not the Duke, who watched her stand through the remainder of the hearing without once being offered or accepting a chair, and who found that the satisfaction he had expected to feel did not come. Simmons, from his post by the doors, observed the remainder of the hearing with the fixed, wooden expression of a man determined to give the household nothing to gossip about from his own face. Though he confided to the housekeeper, Mrs. Yarrow, that evening over a late supper in the servants' hall, that he had not seen a room go so quiet so fast since the old Duke's funeral, and that in his opinion the girl had conducted herself better standing than half the peerage of the county managed sitting down. The tenants who witnessed it carried the story home along with their own quarter's business, embellishing it a little more with each telling, so that by the following market day in the village it had already acquired the shape it would keep for years afterward, the shape of a small plain fact repeated until it hardened into local legend, that the steward's daughter had been told to her face she was not wanted in a chair, and had stood and had corrected the Duke's own steward's arithmetic without so much as a tremor in her voice. Eleanor herself gave the story no further thought than she could help. She finished the remainder of her business, secured Pruitt's grudging agreement to revisit the ditch measurements the following week, gathered her ledgers, and left the hall by the side door without waiting to be dismissed, because she had a sick father waiting at home and no patience left over for lingering in a room that had shown her, plainly enough, what it thought of her. The Duke watched her go and told himself the matter was closed. It was, in fact, only just beginning. The drainage dispute was not resolved that day, nor the next, and it was this unfinished business, mundane and procedural as it was, that brought Eleanor back to Cravenwood 3 times in as many weeks, each visit conducted not in the great hall, but in the estate office, a low stone room off the stable yard where Pruitt kept his books, and where, increasingly, the Duke found reasons of his own to be present. He told himself the first time that he wished to see the drainage matter settled fairly, since a wrongly measured boundary could sour tenant relations for a generation. He told himself the second time that he wished to observe whether the Hartwell girl's competence was a fluke or a habit. By the third visit he had stopped troubling to tell himself anything at all, and simply came. What he found each time unsettled the shape of his first judgment a little further. Eleanor did not flatter him, did not perform the deference that most of his tenantry offered out of long habit, and did not, crucially, seem to require his approval in order to do her work well. She spoke to Pruitt as a colleague whose errors she was willing to correct without cruelty, though also without much patience for his wounded pride. She spoke to the Duke, when she spoke to him at all, with a plain civility that never once slipped into the eager warmth he was accustomed to receiving from people who wanted something from him. She wanted nothing from him beyond a fair hearing for her father's arrears account, and this, more than her arithmetic, was the thing that began, slowly, to work on him. He began to notice, in the way a man notices a thing he has decided not to examine too closely, that a lamp burned late most nights in the window of the steward's cottage at the edge of the home wood, visible from his own study across the darkening park if he happened to be standing near the glass at the right hour, which he told himself he was not arranging to do. The lamp meant she was still at the Ledgers, her father too unwell now to help her. The estate's late accounts falling more and more into her sole keeping, though no one had asked this of her and the Duke had certainly not offered to pay her for it. He watched the small orange square of light some nights longer than the business of the estate could account for, and said nothing of it to anyone, and believed for a while that this discretion made the watching harmless. On his second visit to the estate office he had attempted, for want of anything better to say, a small pleasantry about the weather, and Eleanor had answered him with the correct figure for that quarter's rainfall as recorded in her father's weather book, delivered so plainly that he could not tell for a full moment whether she had misunderstood him or refused, quite deliberately, to indulge him. And it was only when he caught the faint, dry movement at the corner of her mouth that he understood it had been the latter, a joke made so straight-faced that a lesser man would have missed it entirely. He found to his own surprise that he had not minded being made the subject of it. On his third visit he arrived to find her already occupied, not with the drainage dispute at all, but with a widow named Mrs. Colley, whose late husband's small-holding rent had, according to Pruitt's own books, gone unpaid for 2 quarters running, an arrears that would by custom have seen the woman's few sheep seized against the debt before Michaelmas. Eleanor had gone back through the receipts herself, unasked, and found that the payments had in fact been made and simply misfiled under the neighbouring farm's account. An error that would have cost a grieving widow her livelihood had no one troubled to look twice at Pruitt's tidy but careless columns. She presented the correction to the Duke without drama, laid the misfiled receipts on the desk between them, and said only that she thought he would wish to know before the matter went any further, and he understood, watching her, that she had not done it to impress him, had perhaps not even considered that he would be there to see it, and that this, more than anything she might have said in her own defence, was the thing that undid the last of his certainty about who she was. He signed the correction himself, thanked her with more warmth than the transaction strictly required, and left the office with the uncomfortable sense of a man who has been quietly and thoroughly outclassed by someone who had not been trying. It was his aunt who first said the thing aloud that he had been declining to think in full sentences. Lady Beatrice Thorne, his father's younger sister, had kept house at Cravenwood since her own husband's death some years before, and she possessed the particular license of an aunt who had known a man since his cradle to say to him what no one else in the household dared. She found her nephew at the study window one evening in early summer, ostensibly reading correspondence, actually watching the small lit square across the park with an attention that had gone on rather too long to be accidental, and she said, without preamble, "You have been standing at that window 3 evenings out of 5 for a fortnight, Julian, and I do not think it is the drainage ditch that holds your interest." He did not turn from the glass. The matter is not yet settled. The matter, said his aunt, was settled a week ago, according to Pruitt, who is sulking about it in the servants' hall as we speak. What has not been settled is whatever it is you are doing at this window. He had no answer for her, which was itself an answer, and Lady Beatrice, satisfied, did not press him further that night, though she watched him rather more closely afterward. It was his niece, Cecily, orphan daughter of his late brother and ward of the house at 9 years old, who pressed the matter from an angle no adult would have dared. Cecily had wandered, as she often did, past the steward's cottage on her pony rides, and had struck up an acquaintance with Eleanor over a tornhim and a correctly identified species of moth, and had come home full of the news that Miss Hartwell knew everything, could add sums in her head faster than her governess, and had promised to show her how to press flowers properly. That promise was kept the following Sunday, when Cecily arrived at the cottage door with a governess trailing reluctantly behind her and a basket of cowslips gathered, by her own proud account, entirely without assistance, and Eleanor set aside an afternoon's ledger work to show her how to lay the blooms flat between sheets of blotting paper weighted with her father's heaviest account book. A use for the ledgers Josiah found considerably more amusing than any entry he had ever recorded in them. "Why do you keep such careful books if no one thanks you for it?" Cecily asked, with the particular bluntness of a child testing the shape of an idea she has not yet learned to soften, watching Eleanor rule a fresh column with a steadiness that never varied whether she was calculating rents or explaining herself to a 9-year-old. "Because the books do not require thanking," Eleanor answered, "only accuracy, and I have found accuracy to be a good deal more reliable than gratitude, which comes and goes according to other people's moods." Cecily considered this with great seriousness, the way she considered most things Eleanor told her, and pressed her cowslips exactly as instructed, and carried the finished pages home to show her uncle with an enthusiasm that did a good deal more, in its quiet way, to soften his opinion of the steward's cottage than any argument Lady Beatrice might have constructed on Eleanor's behalf. "Why are you unkind to her, Uncle Julian?" Cecily asked one evening, with the terrible directness of a child who has not yet learned that adults prefer their cruelties left unnamed, when you look at her cottage every night as though you wished you were there instead of here. The Duke set down his pen very carefully, the way a man sets down something he is afraid of breaking, and told his niece that grown matters were not hers to untangle, which even Cecily recognized as the sound of a man who had no better answer. Below stairs, the change in him had not gone unremarked either, though it was discussed with considerably more freedom than it was upstairs. Simmons observed to Mrs. Yarrow over the polishing of a great deal of silver that did not strictly need it, that his Grace had taken to reading the same letter 3 times before sealing it these last weeks, and had twice countermanded an order to have the home wood-path re-gravelled, on the grounds, he claimed, that the current surface suited the estate's character, though Simmons privately suspected it suited a particular evening walk rather better than it suited any horse. Mrs. Yarrow, who had known the Duke since he was breeched, allowed that she had not seen him take a second helping at dinner with any appetite since before his father's passing, and had noticed, further, that he had stopped correcting Cecily's Latin at table in his usual clipped fashion, and had instead taken to listening to her chatter about Miss Hartwell's pressed flowers with an attention Mrs. Yarrow considered, in her own words, downright suspicious in a man of his age and rank. Neither of them said the word aloud that both of them were thinking, because it was not their place to say it, but the servants' hall at Cravenwood had reached its own quiet consensus on the matter a full season before the Duke himself was willing to admit to it in daylight. The public test came at the hall's midsummer assembly, an evening the Duke's late mother had begun, and Lady Beatrice had continued out of loyalty to her memory, to which the neighbourhood gentry were invited along with a handful of the estate's more prominent tenants. A blending of ranks, that was tolerated one night a year and forgotten the rest. Eleanor attended at Lady Beatrice's own insistence over Pruitt's visible disapproval. Because the estate's tenant charity accounts were to be reviewed that evening and no one else could speak to them with authority, and Lady Beatrice, who had taken a private liking to the girl's steadiness, saw no reason a competent woman should be excluded from a room merely because her father did not own land. Eleanor wore her one good gown, dove grey trimmed in a darker ribbon, and stood at the edge of the assembly with the charity ledger under her arm, entirely composed and entirely aware that she did not belong to the room in the way its other occupants did. Miss Verity Colcroft, who had spent the intervening months watching the Duke's attention drift in a direction she had not sanctioned, chose that evening to remark, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough, that it was a curious thing to see a steward's daughter dressed as though she attended such evenings often, and wondered aloud whether the girl had learned her arithmetic before or after she had learned to angle for a duke's notice. The remark landed among a cluster of guests near enough to the Duke that he could not pretend not to have heard it, and the room, sensing blood, went quiet in the particular way rooms do when they are waiting to see whether a powerful man will allow a smaller person to be cut down in front of him. Verity had chosen her moment with some care, waiting until the charity ledger had been presented and praised by two of the visiting magistrates' wives, so that her unkindness would land not on an obscure girl at the edge of the room, but on a woman who had, moments before, been the object of a small, grudging admiration, the better to sting by contrast. Eleanor did not flush, did not look toward the Duke for rescue, and did not retreat toward the terrace doors as a lesser composure might have counselled. She stood exactly where she had been standing, the ledger still under her arm, and regarded Miss Colcroft with the same plain, unhurried attention she gave a column of figures that did not yet balance, as though waiting to see where the error in the woman's reasoning might be found. It was this stillness, more than any words she might have offered in her own defence, that seemed to unsettle Verity further, and it was into this particular silence, charged and waiting, that the Duke's voice fell. He did not raise his voice, and he did not deliver the grand rebuke the room might have wanted for its drama. Instead he said, with the flat, factual authority he used for estate business, that Miss Hartwell's survey of the Fennersbrook boundary had saved the estate a costly resurveying, and had, moreover, prevented 3 tenant cottages from flooding the previous autumn by identifying a drainage fault his own steward had overlooked for 2 years, and that he was not aware any guest present that evening had performed a service to the estate of comparable value. It was not a declaration of feeling. It was, deliberately, nothing of the kind. It was a ledger entry read aloud, a fact set against an unkindness, the sort of practical defence a man could make without confessing anything he was not yet ready to confess. But the room understood it exactly as it was meant, and Verity Colcroft, flushing, found nothing further to say, and withdrew toward the card tables with the particular dignity of a woman pretending not to have been rooted. Eleanor, for her part, said nothing either, though something in her carriage eased very slightly, the wariness she had carried into that room loosening by a fraction. And later, when Lady Beatrice found her a quiet moment near the terrace doors, Eleanor admitted only that she had not expected to be defended, least of all by him, least of all in front of a room she had every reason to expect would delight in her humbling. "He did not defend you as a man defends a woman he is fond of," Lady Beatrice observed, watching her nephew across the crowded terrace with the fond, assessing eye of a woman who had once been young and in love herself and had not entirely forgotten the shape of it. He defended you as he would defend a good decision, which I promise you is a rarer compliment from that particular man than any pretty speech he might have made instead. Eleanor turned the observation over as she turned over most things offered to her, weighing it for its truth rather than its charm, and found, somewhat against her own better judgment, that she believed it, and that the belief unsettled her rather more than the insult had. He came to the steward's cottage 3 nights after the assembly, an hour past dark, on no pretext at all this time. No ledger under his arm, no drainage matter to discuss, and Eleanor, opening the door to find the Duke of Cravenwood standing on her father's doorstep with his hat in his hand like a man uncertain of his welcome, did not know what to make of it until he spoke. "I have come to apologize," he said, "and I find I do not know how to do it well, having had very little practice." She let him in, because her father was asleep and there was no one to disapprove, and set the lamp between them on the small table where she kept her ledgers, and waited. "I judged you before I had met you," the Duke said, "on the word of a woman who wished to see you diminished, and on a morning when I was too full of my own grief to trouble myself with the truth of anyone else's circumstance. It was the anniversary of my father's death. I do not say that to excuse what I said to you in that hall, only to account for it, because I think you deserve the accounting, even though it changes nothing about how it must have felt to hear it." Eleanor listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table's worn wood, and when he had finished she said, quietly, that she had not needed him to explain himself, but that she was glad all the same that he had. "I have thought of that morning more than I would like to admit," she said. "Not because it wounded my pride, though it did, but because I have spent most of my life being told, in one way or another, that the room I am standing in was not built with me in mind. I am accustomed to it. I did not expect to hear it from a duke's own mouth in front of half the county, and I did not expect, still less, that the same mouth would later stand up for me before a worse room than that one. I have been a coward about it since," he admitted. "I have stood at my window and watched your lamp, and told myself it was estate business that kept me looking." Eleanor's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I wondered whose eyes I felt on my back some evenings," she said. "I told myself it was only the owl's. I am not an owl," the Duke said, with a gravity so complete that Eleanor laughed outright, a short, startled sound she had not offered him before, and something in his shoulders eased at the hearing of it, as though he had been braced for a colder reception than the one he had received. "No," she agreed, "you are a good deal less wise and a good deal more trouble, your Grace." "Julian," he said, "if we are to sit up half the night trading confessions across your father's table, I think we might dispense with the title." She considered this a moment, turning it over the way she turned over a column of figures before committing to a sum. "Julian, then," she allowed, "though I make no promise to use it in front of Pruitt, who I think would faint dead away." The confession, once begun, did not stop there, though it moved slowly, in the halting way that honesty moves between two people unaccustomed to offering it. The Duke told her that night, and on several nights after, about the woman he had once been engaged to marry, a match arranged in his father's lifetime to a family of good name and better fortune, who had broken the engagement within a season of his father's death, when it became clear his grief had made him, in her words, tedious company, and had married a viscount with better prospects and worse debts within the year. He told Eleanor that he had converted the humiliation of it into a kind of policy, a rigid insistence on order and precedence and the keeping of every person to their proper chair, because it was easier to police a room than to trust a person in it again. "I do not tell you this so that you will pity me," he added, when Eleanor's silence stretched a moment too long for his comfort. "I tell you because I think you are owed some accounting of why a man who had never met you decided, in the space of a single sentence, that you did not deserve a chair in his own hall. It was never about the chair, Eleanor. It was never really about you at all. Not that morning. You simply happened to be standing where 7 years of temper finally found somewhere to land." "I understand that a good deal better than you might expect," Eleanor said. "My mother died when I was 12, and my father buried himself so entirely in his ledgers afterward that I learned arithmetic before I learned to properly grieve alongside him, because it was the only language he had left that did not require him to speak of her. I do not say this to compare our griefs, only to say that I know what it costs a person to build a wall instead of asking for help, and I do not think less of you for having built one. I only wonder how long you intend to go on living behind it." The Duke had no ready answer for that, and did not attempt to manufacture one, and the silence that followed was, for the first time between them, not an uncomfortable one. Eleanor, in her turn, admitted a fear she had not spoken aloud even to her father, that whatever regard the Duke felt for her would curdle, sooner or later, into the same kind of story the county already told about ambitious girls who angled above their station, that she would lose the one thing she had built for herself, her competence, her father's trust in her hands, her own good name among the tenants who came to her now as readily as they had once come to her father, if she allowed herself to be folded into a duke's household as anything other than what she already was. "I do not wish to be your charity," she told him plainly. "And I do not wish to become a story people tell about how a duke was softened by a pretty face and a head for figures. I would rather keep my ledgers and my father's good name than gain a title and lose the only thing I have ever been sure of, which is that my work is my own." The Duke did not argue with her. He sat with the weight of it a long moment, turning his hat in his hands, and said only that he understood the fear better than she perhaps credited him for, since he had spent 7 years guarding himself against exactly the kind of loss she now described, and that he would rather lose whatever he hoped to gain from her than ask her to become smaller in order to have it. "I have watched what happened to my father after my mother died," Eleanor added, more quietly, "and to my own father since his illness. Men who built something with their hands and then had it managed for them by people who meant well and understood nothing. I do not wish that for myself. I would rather be poor and certain of my own worth than comfortable and dependent on another person's good faith, however sincerely it is offered tonight." "Then I will not ask you to be dependent on it," the Duke said. "I will ask you to hold me to it instead, which I think you are considerably better equipped to do than most." Eleanor looked at him a long moment in the lamplight, weighing the offer the way she weighed every offer that came to her, for its substance rather than its polish, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him. What he offered her when he came again a fortnight later was not, at first, the offer the county would have expected of him. He came to the estate office in daylight this time, with Pruitt present and the household solicitor summoned from the county town, and proposed, formally and on the record, that the office of land agent for the Cravenwood estate be settled upon Eleanor Hartwell in her own name and her own right, her father's failing health notwithstanding, at a salary equal to what any man holding the post had ever been paid, an arrangement no estate in the county had made before, and one Pruitt received with visible and unconcealed horror. It was, Eleanor understood at once, not a romantic gesture dressed up as a practical one, but the reverse. A practical gesture that happened also to be the truest declaration he had yet made her. An acknowledgment in the estate's own books, where such things could not later be denied or softened into rumour, that her competence was not a favour he was doing her, but a fact he intended to honour whether or not anything further ever passed between them. "I do not offer you this to buy your regard," he said, when Pruitt and the solicitor had gone, and they were alone in the office with the ledgers between them. "I offer it because it is owed, and because I find I would rather see you settled in a place no one can take from you than see you dependent on my good opinion, which is changeable and imperfect, and not something a person of sense should build a life upon." It was, Eleanor thought later, the least romantic proposal a man had ever made, and the most honest, and she told him so, and he laughed, the first unguarded laugh she had heard from him, and said that he supposed a woman who corrected his steward's arithmetic in front of the whole county was unlikely to be moved by pretty speeches in any case. Pruitt, for his part, spent the better part of a week in a state of quiet mutiny, muttering to anyone who would listen in the servants' hall that he did not know what the estate was coming to when a chit of a girl was made land agent over the heads of men who had trained for the post since boyhood, though it was noted by more than one observer that his objections grew markedly quieter after. Eleanor, with no apparent malice, corrected a further 2 errors in his own account books within the month, and said nothing of it to the Duke at all, choosing instead to hand the corrections to Pruitt privately with a note that read only, in her small economical hand, that she trusted he would wish to amend the figures before the quarter's audit. It was, Lady Beatrice observed afterward, a more effective silencing than any dressing down the Duke could have administered, precisely because it asked nothing of him but his own better judgment. And Pruitt, whatever his private grumbling, was not so poor a clerk that he failed to recognise a colleague sparing him a public humiliation when she might easily have claimed one. Eleanor herself walked home that evening along the low lane by Fenner's Brook, past the very ditch that had first brought her to the Duke's notice, now running clean and well graded between its banks, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily account for, entirely without the low, familiar hum of worry that had accompanied her home from Cravenwood on every previous occasion. The office was hers. Whatever else came of the evening's conversation, that much, at least, could not be taken from her by gossip, by marriage, or by any change in a duke's affections, and she held the certainty of it the whole walk home like a warm stone carried in a cold pocket. She did not tell him that day the other thing she felt, because she had not yet finished deciding what to do with it, and Eleanor Hartwell was not a woman who spoke a thing aloud before she had settled its shape in her own mind. She accepted the office gladly, and at once the deeper question, the one that sat beneath it, she asked leave to consider, and the Duke, to his credit, did not press her, though the waiting cost him visibly. It was another month before she came to him, on an evening in late summer, with the lamp lit in her window as it had been lit on so many nights before, and found him as she had somehow known she would, Standing at the edge of the home wood, where the path from the cottage met the low stone wall that marked the boundary between the steward's grounds and the hall's own gardens, a wall neither of them had ever crossed without occasion. "I have been turning the matter over," she said, without preamble, because preamble had never suited either of them, and I find I keep arriving at the same place, which is that I do not wish to be a duchess, who is remembered for having once been a steward's daughter, made respectable by marriage. I wish, if I am to be anything to you at all, to be a woman whose work stands on its own account, married or not, titled or not, and I wish you to understand that I will not set down my ledgers for a coronet, not for you, not for anyone. I would think less of you if you offered to," the Duke said, and crossed the last of the distance between them, though he stopped short of the wall, as though he understood that the crossing, when it came, ought to be hers to make. For a moment neither of them spoke, the lamplight from the cottage window laying a thin gold line across the grass between them, and Eleanor felt the old caution rise in her once more. The accumulated weight of every warning she had ever been given about girls who reached above their station, and what the reaching generally cost them. "You understand what the county will say of me," she said, "whatever settlement you make on paper. They will say I contrived it. They will say it of me at every dinner table in the shire for the rest of my life, and there will be nothing in any ledger that answers it. Because it is not the kind of accusation that arithmetic can correct. They will say it for a season," the Duke answered, "and then they will find some newer scandal to occupy them, because that is the nature of county gossip, and in the meantime you will still be the best land agent this estate has employed in 3 generations, a fact no amount of talk at dinner tables can alter. I cannot promise you the county's good opinion, Eleanor. I can only promise you mine, and my own hand at your side while you earn whatever else you are owed. I am not asking you to set anything down, Eleanor. I am asking you to keep it all, and to let me stand beside you while you do." It was the first time he had used her given name without the courtesy of her surname attached to it, and she heard the shift in it the way the household would come, in time, to understand it, as the moment the last of the old distance closed. She crossed the wall herself, unhurried, the way she had once risen from a chair no one had invited her to take, and did not wait for his hand to help her over it. They were married the following spring, in the parish church at Cravenwood rather than in the county town. A choice Eleanor had asked for, and the Duke had granted without argument, because she wished her father, whose health had improved enough to attend in a wheeled chair, to be able to make the short journey. The wedding was smaller than the county thought proper for a duke, and larger, in one particular, than any wedding the parish had seen before, for the front pew on the bride's side, ordinarily left sparse for a family of no great number, was filled instead with tenants who had come to see the girl, who had once corrected a steward's arithmetic and a duke's judgment in the same breath, and who considered the day, in some private accounting of their own, as much theirs as hers. Lady Beatrice wept without shame through the whole of the service, and claimed credit for the match at every dinner party for the rest of her life, generally in defiance of the facts. Cecily, 11 now and insufferably pleased with herself for having identified the whole business a year before any adult had managed it, was permitted to carry the bride's flowers, and told everyone who would listen that she had known it all along. Even Pruitt, who had never quite forgiven Eleanor for the error in the drainage tally, attended the wedding breakfast and, after a glass of the Duke's better claret, allowed that her Grace kept the finest set of books he had encountered in 30 years of estate management, which from Pruitt constituted an apology, a surrender, and a benediction all at once. The morning of the wedding broke clear and cold in the particular way an early spring morning can be both at once. Frost silvering the churchyard grass and a thin bright sun burning it off by the time the bells began, and Eleanor walked from the steward's cottage to the parish church on her father's arm. His wheeled chair abandoned for the occasion in favour of 2 sticks and his own considerable stubbornness. A distance of perhaps a quarter-mile that took the better part of 20 minutes, and that neither of them would have shortened for any consideration. Josiah Hartwell wept without any attempt at concealment when the vows were spoken, and told his daughter afterward at the wedding breakfast that he had never once in the long years of teaching her his ledgers imagined they would lead her to a duke's own hall, though he supposed, on reflection, that a man ought not to be surprised when a well-kept set of books proved, in the end, to be worth more than anyone had troubled to reckon. Simmons presiding over the breakfast with the particular satisfaction of a servant who has watched a household's fortunes mend from the inside, permitted himself, for the first time in Eleanor's recollection, a natural smile, and told her privately, as he refilled her glass, that he had known the whole business would end this way since the morning she had first refused to sit back down, though he had wisely kept the opinion to himself at the time. Lady Beatrice, who had indeed wept through the whole of the service, spent the remainder of the breakfast informing anyone within earshot that she had arranged the match herself through careful management of the household's evening lamps. A claim so thoroughly divorced from the facts that even Cecily, at 11, rolled her eyes at it, though she was gracious enough not to correct her aunt in front of company. The years that followed settled into a shape neither of them had quite imagined on the morning she had first sat in a chair she was not invited to take. Eleanor kept the land agency in her own name for the whole of her life, and within a decade 2 other estates in the county had followed Cravenwood's example and appointed women to posts long assumed to belong to men by nature rather than by habit, a change the old families grumbled about, and the young families quietly welcomed. The drainage at Fenner's Brook never flooded again. The chair at the foot of the day's steps, the one she had sat in on that first cold morning, was never again left to ambiguous custom. The Duke had it fitted with a small brass plate, unremarkable to anyone who did not know the story, that read simply Hartwell, and thereafter it was understood by everyone at Cravenwood, tenant and gentry alike, that the chair belonged to whoever held the land agency, man or woman, and that it was to be offered, not claimed. Cecily grew into a young woman with her aunt's plain steadiness and her uncle's dry humour, and when she was old enough to attend her first quarter court in a chair of her own consequence, it was Eleanor who leaned over to tell her quietly what that particular chair had once cost, and what it had come, in the end, to mean. Their own children, a boy and then a girl, grew up hearing the story so often from tenants and servants alike that it lost, for them, any quality of legend, and became simply a fact of the household's furniture, the way another family might have an old sword above the mantel, or a portrait no one quite remembered the sitter of. They knew their mother had once been told she was not wanted in a chair, and that their father had been the one to say it, and that the 2 of them had married anyway, and this struck both children at various ages as either wildly romantic or faintly ridiculous, depending on how recently they had quarrelled with their own siblings over a disputed seat at the nursery table. Josiah Hartwell lived to see his first grandchild christened before he died peacefully in the cottage that had been his home for 30 years, his ledgers passed on by then in their entirety to his daughter, who kept his oldest account book on a shelf in her own office at the Hall, not for its usefulness, which had long since expired, but because the handwriting in its early pages was his, and she found she was not yet ready to file it away among records that no longer mattered to anyone living. The Duke, for his part, never again presided over a court without first glancing toward the chair at the foot of the dais steps, a habit the household came to recognize as his own quiet way of taking the room's measure before he trusted himself to speak in it. And more than one nervous petitioner over the years found their case heard with an unexpected patience, simply because his Grace had learned, at considerable personal cost, how easily a tired man's temper could mistake a stranger's silence for insolence, when it was, in fact, only exhaustion, or grief, or the plain, ordinary courage it takes to stand one's ground in a room built to make a person feel small. In the evenings, when the light went early in autumn, 2 lamps could often be seen from the home wood path, one in the cottage that had become the land agent's office in truth as well as name, now attended by a junior clerk under Eleanor's direction, and one in the Duke's own study window across the darkened park, each visible to the other, neither one watched in secret any longer, both of them simply the ordinary, steady evidence of 2 people who had long since stopped pretending they were looking at anything else. And when, on the 10th anniversary of that first court, a nervous young widow came to the Hall to render her late husband's tenant accounts and hesitated at the edge of the standing crowd, uncertain and travel-worn and afraid of taking up more room than she was owed, it was the Duke himself who caught her eye from the dais, inclined his head toward the chair with the small brass plate, and said, in a voice gentled by years but pitched still to carry the length of the hall, that she was welcome to sit, that the chair was there for exactly such a purpose, and that no one in that room, not one soul among them, was likely to forget the woman who had first taught Cravenwood what the chair was for.